Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heaven We're Thinking. Today we're continuing on Leviticus. We're going to be looking at Leviticus chapter 14. It's another long chapter. We're going to read it and see what God is saying to us today through this chapter. So I'll read it and we'll get right into this week's lesson. The Lord said to Moses, "These are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing, when they are brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest shall order that the 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. Then the priest shall order that one of the birds be killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He is then to take the live bird and dip it, together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease, and then pronounce them clean. After that he is to release the live bird in the open fields. The person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After this they may come into the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day they must shave off all their hair. They must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and they will be clean. On the 8th day they must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. The priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the priest is to take one of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering along with a log of oil. He shall wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He is to slaughter the lamb in the sanctuary area where the sin offering and the burnt offering are slaughtered. Like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The priest shall then take some of the log of oil, pour it in the palm of his own left hand, dip his right forefinger into the oil in his palm, and with his fingers sprinkle some of it before the Lord 7 times. The priest is to put some of the oil remaining in his palm on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe of the right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, and make atonement for them before the Lord. Then the priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from their uncleanness. After that, the priest shall slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar together with the grain offering, and make atonement for them, and they will be clean. If, however, they are poor and cannot afford these, they must take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for them, together with 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, a log of oil, and 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, such as they can afford, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day they must bring them for their cleansing to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest is to take the lamb for the guilt offering, together with the log of oil, and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He shall slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering and take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe of the right foot. The priest is to pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and with his right forefinger sprinkle some of the oil from his palm 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in his palm he is to put on the same places he put the blood of the guilt offering, on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe of the right foot. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, to make atonement for them before the Lord. Then he shall sacrifice the doves or the young pigeons, such as the person can afford, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the grain offering. In this way the priest will make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the one to be cleansed. These are the regulations for anyone who has a defiling skin disease and who cannot afford the regular offerings for their cleansing. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your possession, and I put a spreading mold in a house in that land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, 'I have seen something that looks like a defiling mold in my house.' The priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mold, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mold on the walls, and if it has greenish or reddish depressions that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out of the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the 7th day the priest shall return to inspect the house. If the mold has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped, and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside the town. They are to take other stones to replace these, and take new clay and plaster the house. If the defiling mold reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and plastered, the priest is to go and examine it, and if the mold has spread in the house, it is a persistent defiling mold. The house is unclean. It must be torn down, its stones, timbers, and all the plaster, and taken out of the town to an unclean place. Anyone who goes into the house while it is closed up will be unclean till evening. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash their clothes. But if the priest comes to examine it, and the mold has not spread after the house has been plastered, he shall pronounce the house clean, because the defiling mold is gone. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. He shall kill one of the birds over fresh water in a clay pot. Then he is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird, dip them into the blood of the dead bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall purify the house with the bird's blood, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird in the open fields outside the town. In this way he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. These are the regulations for any defiling skin disease, for a sore, for defiling molds in fabric or in a house, and for a swelling, a rash, or a shiny spot, to determine when something is clean or unclean. These are the regulations for defiling skin diseases and defiling molds. This chapter builds upon what we talked about last week, where we examined what happens when there is a defiling skin disease, and what happens when there is a mold in a person's house with certain articles of clothing or certain fabrics. We saw last week that God is, again, making a distinction between the Israelites and the communities around them. He's calling them to live differently, including how they treat those with skin diseases, how they have to sometimes be isolated for a while and then come back to the community when they are clean, how there is a distinction between the pure and the impure, whether it be people or even articles of clothing and different articles in daily use and daily functions. Here we see both the cleansing from defiling skin diseases and the cleansing from molds on whether it be articles of clothing or whether it even be the house structure, as we saw at the end of this chapter. Again, God making a very clear distinction between clean and unclean. Here, we're seeing what happens when a person is declared clean again, what happens when an article or a house is declared clean again. Starting with the cleansing from defiling skin diseases, we see that God gives Moses some very specific instructions of how, when a person is declared clean, how the priest is to offer sacrifices that the person gives to the Lord to cleanse them. Again, this whole idea of animal sacrifice has been emphasized throughout the book of Leviticus, even stretching back into Exodus that we looked at many, many weeks ago. And it's going to be something we see throughout the Old Testament, that sin brings about a need for a blood sacrifice. Ultimately, that was satisfied by Jesus' blood shed on the cross. But at this time period, before Jesus was crucified for you and for me, the blood sacrifices were made through animals. And again, these were temporary things. And so we've seen that when people sinned, they had to offer a sacrifice. When the community was found to have guilt, they had to offer a sacrifice. And this was something that would be done again and again. Same thing here with these people who are being declared clean. After they had been unclean, now they have to offer a sacrifice to the Lord that the priest has to do in a prescribed way, signifying that this person is now clean, that the impurity has been removed from them. Not just the sinfulness of actions, but also the impurity that comes with these defiling skin diseases, and then later on in the chapter that comes with these defiling and persistent molds. Again, God is really emphasizing this idea that he is a holy God, and he's called his people to be holy. He's called them to be whole, not just in how they live their lives with regard to sin, but also in how they live their lives with regard to common things that happen to them, such as these diseases and these molds, things that happen because of our sinfulness breaking down the world around us. The curse that came because of our sin affects the world around us and affects things like diseases. It affects things like molds, and how God is calling the Israelites to respond differently than the communities around them, how he's giving them some regulations that would both benefit them in a materialistic way and in a very, very physical, practical way to help keep their communities safe, to keep them healthy, but also to signify the more important matters of the spiritual matters of the community, that they are to be different, and this idea of holiness encompasses their whole lives. And so we see that here in this chapter, and the emphasis, of course, on these sacrifices that are needed in order for these people to be declared clean. And we even see that God gives specific instructions that there can be these sacrifices that are cheaper in nature, so that those who are poor in the community are able to offer these sacrifices to God as well for their cleansing, that the priest can then do what the Lord has prescribed for those who cannot afford the more expensive sacrifices, which could be a problem for people who had to be away from their community, probably away from their livelihood, away from the ability to make money. So when they came back into the community, especially if there were extended time periods, it probably would have been difficult for them to procure the animals needed for the sacrifices. And so it is amazing to see that God cares so much about us as human beings. He cares about us enough to make ways for you and I to fulfill his requirements regardless of our circumstances. He did this here with regard to animal sacrifices. He does it in the rest of our lives, where he makes a way for you and I to be able to serve him regardless of what our circumstances may look like and our situations may look like, whether we are poor, whether we're rich. He has made a way for us to serve him regardless of our income level. And we see that going back all the way here into Leviticus, where it may not even seem like that is the focal point of this chapter, but we certainly can see that here in God's word. And then we see at the end of the chapter just reinforcing everything we've already talked about with these defiling skin diseases and the cleansing that comes with these sacrifices that had to be offered. We see the cleansing of defiling molds. The priest was to be able to go examine a household that was affected, and then they would have to isolate the household for a period of 7 days and not let people go in. Otherwise, things would be unclean, and people would be unclean, and they'd have to wash themselves in a certain way, and they would have to go through this whole process. So they were not to enter the house for this period, and then the priest would go, and if it was clean, well, then they would take care of that mold spot. If it hadn't spread, they would remove it. They would take it to a place ceremonially unclean, so it wouldn't affect anyone else's house that was clean, and then they would fix the house. And if there was no more mold that would spread, well, then the house would be declared clean. And again, there were these sacrifices offered for the atonement of even the house. Yes, God cares enough even to make the dwelling places of the Israelites holy, not just the people themselves, but their dwellings holy, as he has called them to be a holy community. And we see that if the house is then declared clean, they offer these sacrifices, it's all good for that person. But if the house is taken care of, that spot where the priest finds the mold, if it's isolated and then it hasn't spread, and then they take care of the issue, and they patch up the spot, and then the priest finds more spreading in that house, well, then it's a persistent defiling mold, as it says in verse 44 and verses 45, and so that whole place has to be torn down. That whole house is declared unclean, and they have to make atonement again for this defiling mold. The Israelites, again, God's not just giving the Israelites a command for them with regard to their own bodies, but for their dwelling places. And so it should, for us, warn us that what the things we do in life, the places we go, matter to God. The places we live in matter to God. We should make sure that our houses we devote to the Lord, just like the Israelites were definitely given instructions to make sure that their houses were a certain way, and honoring and pleasing to God, because we see that here in this chapter. Obviously, God cared enough for the Israelites that he cared about their dwelling places. Same thing should go for you and I. We might not have some of these same issues in our houses today. When we have an issue, we might not tear down our entire house. We might not have a priest come and pray over our spot, or isolate our house for 7 days and kick us off to live on the street. We might not have that kind of issue today, but we should be looking at our households and setting them apart for the Lord, giving them over to him, since he's given them ultimately to us. And so hopefully in this chapter you're able to see some very applicable teachings that God can give us through his word. And we hope that you've been encouraged and challenged by this, and that you'll join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.